He wasn't born a monster. He became one, a man who convinced millions to follow him into madness. Every decision, every word came from a twisted mind few have truly understood until now. This is a journey inside Hitler's brain. Adolf Hitler ordered the invasion of nations. He signed the death warrants of millions. He turned Europe into a graveyard. But why? He split communities apart. He made neighbors, betrayed neighbors. He turned ordinary men into executioners. What kind of mind could do this? This is not just about history. It's about the mind of a man who weaponized belief itself. Hitler's psychology was a perfect storm. Childhood beatings, humiliating failures, a hunger for power, and an obsession so deep it bent reality to his will. Every speech, every order, every atrocity followed a mental blueprint years in the making, one built in the shadows long before the world knew his name. In today's video, we're stepping inside his mind, tracing the path from a broken boy in Austria to the architect of global destruction, and uncovering the disturbing psychology that made it all possible. Chapter 1. The Broken Child. Early life and psychological seeds. Before Adolf Hitler became the dictator who plunged the world into war, he was a boy in a small Austrian border town, growing up in a household defined by two extremes: the iron discipline of his father and the tender devotion of his mother. His father, Adolf Hitler, a customs officer, demanded obedience and enforced it with a heavy hand. His mother, Clara, was gentle and fiercely protective, often shielding her son from Alois's temper. This push and pull between harsh authority and unconditional affection would leave deep marks on Hitler's understanding of power, loyalty, and control. From a young age, Hitler yearned for approval, particularly from his father, yet constantly clashed with him over his future. Alois wanted his son to follow a stable career in the civil service. Adolf wanted to be an artist. Arguments were frequent, and each defeat in these battles of will planted seeds of resentment and an unshakable need to prove himself. At the same time, the deaths of several siblings left Clara even more attached to her surviving children, especially Adolf, who became the center of her hopes. But this closeness also fostered emotional dependence, a craving for adoration that he would seek on a much larger scale later in life. By his teenage years, Hitler's academic performance had declined. He preferred drawing and grand daydreams over schoolwork. At 16, he dropped out. His artistic ambitions led him to Vienna, where he faced the crushing rejection of the Academy of Fine Arts, not once, but twice. The humiliation of these failures deepened his belief that the world was blind to his talent. Vienna, however, became his classroom. Living in cheap hostels and scraping by selling sketches, Hitler immersed himself in the city's volatile political atmosphere. It was here that he absorbed the ideas that would poison his worldview: extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the concept of a greater Germany. In Vienna, Hitler's worldview hardened. He began to see life in absolutes: strong versus weak, pure versus corrupt, victory versus annihilation. This rigid thinking would later define his leadership style. Despite his failures, he began to imagine himself as a man destined for greatness, a belief rooted in narcissistic traits, grandiosity, a need for validation, and a sense that normal rules didn't apply to him. World War I became the turning point. In 1914, he enlisted in the Bavarian army, serving as a messenger on the Western Front. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose and belonging. The war gave him structure, camaraderie, and recognition, earning him 2 medals for bravery. But it also reinforced his hatred for Germany's enemies and his belief in the glory of sacrifice for the nation. When the war ended in 1918 with Germany's defeat, Hitler saw it not as a military loss, but as a betrayal. The Treaty of Versailles, with its harsh reparations, became in his mind a national humiliation, a wound that needed avenging. By the time the war was over, the psychological blueprint of the future dictator was in place. A craving for control shaped by a domineering father, an emotional hunger for admiration fostered by a protective mother, a rigid worldview cemented in Vienna, a belief in personal destiny born of narcissism, and a tendency to blame others for every setback. None of these traits alone created a dictator, but together, in the right political climate, they would ignite a chain of events that would devastate the world. Hitler's early life shows us that history's greatest atrocities are often rooted in ordinary beginnings, in the slow accumulation of beliefs, habits, and grievances that transform a man from a frustrated youth into a figure capable of unimaginable destruction. His childhood did not excuse what he became, but it explains how the path began. And once that path was set, the world would discover that stopping him would come at a cost measured in millions of lives. Chapter 2, The War Veteran and the Birth of the Demagogue. When World War I came to a bitter end in November 1918, Adolf Hitler was not on the front line celebrating peace. He was lying in a military hospital, recovering from temporary blindness caused by a British mustard gas attack. The news of Germany's surrender did not bring him relief. It shattered something deep inside him. The war had been more than a battlefield for Hitler. It had been a crucible that gave him purpose, a brotherhood that replaced the fractured family of his youth, and a cause that seemed to align with the destiny he had always believed awaited him. Now, that cause had been ripped away. The camaraderie was gone. The fatherland had been humbled. The man who had once marched under the imperial flag now felt as if he had been stripped naked in front of the world. When Hitler returned to civilian life, Germany was unrecognizable. The monarchy had collapsed, replaced by the fledgling Weimar Republic. The streets of Munich were chaotic, filled with demobilized soldiers who had no jobs, food shortages that gnawed at morale, and radical political factions competing for control. Red flags waved in the streets as communist uprisings threatened to overthrow the government, while nationalists seethed at what they saw as betrayal. For Hitler, this wasn't just political disorder, it was a personal insult. He had survived the trenches and believed he had fought for a Germany of honor, only to find the country's pride in tatters. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, poured salt into the wound. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, surrender significant territories, limit its military, and pay crushing reparations to the Allies. For many Germans, this treaty was humiliating. For Hitler, it was unforgivable. He saw it not as the natural outcome of a lost war, but as proof of treachery, the infamous stab-in-the-back myth that claimed Germany had been betrayed from within by corrupt politicians, Marxists, and Jews. This narrative was tailor-made for someone like Hitler, whose worldview thrived on identifying enemies and assigning blame. It gave him a simple explanation for a complex disaster and a clear list of targets for his future rage. After the war, Hitler had no real career prospects. He was still technically enlisted in the army, but with the military drastically reduced, his role shifted from soldier to political observer. The army, fearful of communist revolution in Bavaria, began using loyal veterans to infiltrate and monitor small political groups. In September 1919, one such assignment sent Hitler to a meeting of the German Workers' Party, a tiny nationalist organization with barely 24 members. Initially, he went simply to listen and report. But during the meeting, a speaker made a comment in favor of Bavaria breaking away from Germany, and Hitler exploded. He stood, delivered an impromptu rebuttal, and tore apart the man's argument with a passion and force that startled the room. His words were sharp, his voice commanding, his anger infectious. The party's leaders took note immediately. Here was a man with an extraordinary ability to hold attention, a speaker who didn't just recite facts, but lit a fire in the gut of anyone listening. Within weeks, Hitler was invited to join the party. He accepted, and almost instantly, he became its most electrifying voice. This was the moment he discovered his true weapon: oratory. In an era without television or social media, political influence lived and died in the spoken word. Hitler understood instinctively that a speech was not merely about content, it was about performance. He treated the stage like a battlefield, his words as ammunition, his pauses as moments to reload. He would begin slowly, almost conversationally, painting a bleak picture of Germany's humiliation. Then he would sharpen the edges, naming the supposed culprits: the Jews, the Marxists, the foreign powers that had enslaved the nation. His tone would rise, his gestures grow sharper, his voice thunder with indignation. By the end, the crowd was no longer just listening. They were participating, shouting, saluting, and echoing his fury. Hitler's rhetoric bypassed reason and went straight for emotion. He didn't offer complicated solutions. He offered clarity, the kind of clarity that emerges only when you divide the world into us and them, victory or destruction. In doing so, he gave his audiences not just an explanation for their suffering, but a sense of purpose to fight back under his leadership. This approach worked because it mirrored Hitler's own psychology, his absolute thinking, his narcissistic conviction in his destiny, and his willingness to bend reality to fit his beliefs. By 1920, the German Workers' Party had rebranded itself as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Hitler was shaping not only its message, but its very identity. He helped design the party's new symbol, the swastika, recognizing the power of imagery to unite followers under a single banner. He insisted on uniforms, armbands, and salutes, turning political rallies into theatrical rituals. Meetings moved from cramped back rooms to Munich's large beer halls, where the combination of alcohol, crowd energy, and Hitler's voice created an atmosphere more like a revival than a political event. By 1923, Hitler believed the Nazis were strong enough to take control of Bavaria and eventually Germany by force. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, he launched the Beer Hall Putsch on November 8th. Armed supporters stormed a Munich beer hall where Bavarian leaders were meeting, firing shots into the ceiling and declaring a national revolution. Hitler expected a domino effect, the police and army joining his side, the people flooding the streets. Instead, the next day brought disaster. Armed police blocked the march toward Munich's city center. Gunfire erupted. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler fled only to be arrested and charged with high treason. For most political agitators, this would have been the end. But Hitler used his trial as a national stage. He delivered passionate speeches in court, casting himself as a patriot, willing to sacrifice his life for Germany. The sympathetic judges handed him a lenient sentence of 5 years, and he served just 9 months in Landsberg prison. Prison was not a punishment for Hitler, it was a workshop. With Rudolf Hess as his assistant, he dictated Mein Kampf, part autobiography, part political manifesto, and part prophecy. The book revealed the full architecture of his ideology, the belief in racial hierarchies, the conviction that history was a constant struggle for survival between peoples, and the assertion that propaganda was a far more effective tool than truth. It also showed his grandiosity, the unshakable belief that he alone had been chosen to restore Germany's greatness. Just as important, Landsberg taught him patience. The failed putsch had proven that a sudden coup could be crushed. From now on, he would take power legally, using the democratic system as a Trojan horse to destroy democracy from within. When Hitler was released in December 1924, the political climate had shifted. Germany was experiencing temporary economic stability, and the Nazi Party had splintered during his absence. But Hitler set to work rebuilding it with obsessive focus. He centralized authority under himself, demanded loyalty oaths, and refined the party's propaganda machine. He spoke tirelessly across Germany, often several times a week, to audiences ranging from rural farmers to industrial workers, adapting his tone to match their concerns while always steering the conversation back to his central message. Germany had been betrayed, and only he could lead its rebirth. Hitler also understood the psychological power of symbols and rituals. The brown shirt uniforms of the SA Sturmabteilung erased individuality, binding men together in a brotherhood of violence. The stiff-armed Nazi salute became a physical act of submission and solidarity. The swastika, displayed everywhere, was more than a political logo. It was a badge of belonging, a constant reminder that the movement was omnipresent. By the late 1920s, Hitler had transformed from an embittered veteran shouting in beer halls into a disciplined political commander. Yet his psychology had not changed. It had only found a larger stage. He still saw himself and Germany as victims of a vast conspiracy. He still believed compromise was weakness and that total domination was the only goal worth pursuing. His narcissism had grown with his audience, and his conviction that history had chosen him became unshakable. Then came the Great Depression in 1929. German unemployment soared, banks collapsed, and desperation once again filled the streets. This time, Hitler was ready. He had a national network of followers, a clear and simple message, and the experience to deliver it with devastating effect. The war veteran had become the demagogue, and the demagogue was poised to seize the very power he had once tried to take by force. The next chapter in his transformation from political agitator to propaganda mastermind was about to begin. Chapter 3, The Propaganda Architect, Turning Lies into Power. When the Great Depression swept through Germany in 1929, it did more than cripple banks and close factories. It shattered faith in the Weimar Republic. Millions were out of work, savings vanished overnight, and hunger gnawed at families who once considered themselves secure. In this climate of fear and despair, Adolf Hitler saw his greatest opportunity. He understood something that most politicians of his time did not. People in crisis do not crave complex policy debates. They crave certainty. They crave a voice that tells them who to blame and what to believe. And Hitler was prepared to give them exactly that. By the end of the 1920s, Hitler had already refined his ability to electrify a live audience. But now he needed more than speeches in beer halls. He needed to reach an entire nation. This was where propaganda became his ultimate weapon. Propaganda was not a Nazi invention, but Hitler elevated it into an art form and a science. He believed deeply in its power. In Mein Kampf, he wrote that the masses are more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily, and that effective propaganda must focus on a few simple points repeated endlessly until they become truth in the minds of the people. To turn this theory into practice, Hitler needed someone who could translate his instincts into a nationwide strategy. That man was Joseph Goebbels, a former journalist with a sharp intellect and a fanatical devotion to Hitler. Goebbels became the Nazi Party's chief propagandist in 1929. Together, Hitler and Goebbels built a communications machine unlike anything Germany had seen before. It was relentless, emotionally charged, and omnipresent, a psychological assault designed to shape reality itself. The Nazi propaganda strategy relied on several key principles. First was simplification. Complex economic problems were boiled down to a single cause: Germany's enemies. If unemployment was high, it was because of the Jewish financiers and Marxist saboteurs. If the Treaty of Versailles felt unbearable, it was the work of foreign powers conspiring to keep Germany weak. These explanations were not truthful, but they were easy to understand and remember. The second principle was repetition. Hitler knew that a lie, if repeated often enough, could become accepted as fact. Every speech, every pamphlet, every poster reinforced the same core messages: national humiliation, the need for unity, the promise of rebirth, and the identification of internal and external enemies. Over time, these ideas sank deep into the public consciousness, blurring the line between propaganda and reality. The third principle was emotional appeal. Nazi propaganda did not rely on reasoned argument. It relied on feelings: anger, pride, fear, hope. Images of strong, healthy Aryan families were contrasted with grotesque caricatures of Jews. Films and posters glorified military discipline and rural purity while warning of the decadence of urban life and foreign influence. The goal was not just to persuade, to make people feel as though they were part of a grand, almost sacred mission. The fourth principle was enemy creation. Propaganda needs a villain to be effective, and Hitler's Germany had many. Jews, communists, political dissenters, and foreign powers were painted not just as opponents, but as existential threats. By portraying these groups as dangerous and subhuman, Hitler made it psychologically easier for ordinary citizens to accept and eventually participate in acts of violence and exclusion. The final principle was total saturation. Goebbels' propaganda ministry worked to ensure that the Nazi worldview was inescapable. Posters covered walls in cities and villages. Loudspeakers blasted Hitler's speeches in public squares. Newspapers printed glowing stories of Nazi achievements and vilified their enemies. Radio, a relatively new technology, became one of the most powerful tools. Cheap people's receivers were distributed so that even the poorest Germans could hear Hitler's voice in their homes. Once inside, his words were not easily ignored. Hitler himself was the centerpiece of the propaganda machine. His image was carefully crafted to project strength, decisiveness, and almost mystical authority. Photographs showed him surrounded by adoring crowds, his arm outstretched in the Nazi salute. Films captured him striding purposefully, inspecting troops, or speaking with fiery intensity. He was portrayed as a man of the people, and yet above them, a leader who shared their struggles but possessed the vision to lead them out of darkness. One of the most effective propaganda events was the annual Nuremberg Rally. These gatherings were not political conventions in the traditional sense. They were orchestrated spectacles. Tens of thousands of uniformed followers marched in perfect formation. Enormous banners hung from towering buildings. At night, columns of searchlights shot into the sky, creating what Goebbels called a cathedral of light. Every element was designed to overwhelm the senses, dissolve individuality, and make participants feel they were part of something eternal. Hitler's speeches at these rallies followed a carefully constructed arc. He would begin in a conversational tone, acknowledging Germany's hardships. Gradually, his pace quickened, his voice rose, and his gestures grew sharper. By the climax, his words thundered with righteous fury, and the crowd roared back in unison. Psychologists would later describe this as a form of mass hypnosis, the blending of individual minds into a single, emotionally charged collective. This propaganda machine did more than win elections. It reshaped reality. In the early 1930s, as Hitler campaigned for national office, millions of Germans began to see him not just as a politician, but as the embodiment of the nation's will. Even those who doubted him found it difficult to escape the Nazi narrative. The sheer volume of propaganda made dissent feel abnormal, even dangerous. By 1933, the strategy paid off. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and within months, the Nazis consolidated power. One of their first acts was to ensure total control over the media. Opposition newspapers were shut down. Independent radio stations were absorbed into the state network. Films, theater, literature, and even school curricula were brought under Nazi oversight. From this point on, every word and image consumed by the German public was filtered through the lens of Nazi ideology. In this environment, propaganda evolved from persuasion to indoctrination. It was no longer just about winning support. It was about shaping how people thought, what they believed, and even what they considered possible. Children were targeted through organizations like the Hitler Youth, where they learned Nazi slogans before they could fully read. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify German history, vilify Jews, and present Hitler as the nation's savior. What made this propaganda so devastating was that it exploited deep psychological needs. In a time of instability, it offered order. In a time of humiliation, it offered pride. In a time of uncertainty, it offered absolute answers. Hitler and Goebbels understood that the human mind, when gripped by fear and longing, will cling to a simple, confident voice, even if that voice is leading it toward ruin. For Hitler, propaganda was never just a tool, it was the foundation of his power. He once said, "All propaganda must be popular, and its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to." It was a cynical view, but it worked, not because Germans were inherently gullible, but because they were human beings under extraordinary pressure, yearning for clarity in a world that seemed to have lost its shape. By the mid-1930s, Hitler's control over information was nearly total, and with that control came the ability to remake Germany in his own image. The stage was set for his next psychological evolution, from a master manipulator of perception to an all-powerful dictator consumed by paranoia, control, and the relentless need for loyalty. Chapter 4, The Dictator's Mind, Paranoia, Control, and the Need for Total Loyalty. By the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler's mind was no longer merely that of a shrewd political climber or a master of propaganda. It had evolved into something far more dangerous, the mind of an absolute ruler consumed by paranoia and an obsessive need for control. The transformation was not sudden. It had been building steadily, forged in the fires of his political battles, his unshakable belief in his own destiny, and his ruthless purging of any perceived threat. But as the war years unfolded, this psychological trait became more pronounced, more erratic, and far more destructive, not only for those around him, but for the very empire he sought to preserve. From the earliest days of his leadership, Hitler had cultivated an aura of infallibility. His followers did not merely see him as a man, they saw him as the embodiment of Germany's will. But to maintain that image, Hitler had to ensure that no voice within his inner circle could challenge him. Disagreement, in his eyes, was not a sign of healthy debate. It was betrayal. Those who dared question his strategies or policies, even slightly, found themselves sidelined, exiled from influence, or worse, eliminated entirely. The infamous Night of the Long Knives in 1934 was perhaps the clearest early sign of this mentality. Under the guise of preventing a coup, Hitler ordered the purge of the SA leadership and other political opponents, sending a message that loyalty to him was not optional, it was absolute. This mindset deepened as Germany expanded its military might. By the late 1930s, Hitler had surrounded himself with a cadre of yes men, men whose primary skill was agreeing with the Führer. He preferred loyalty over competence, flattery over independent thinking. This had profound consequences for the German war effort. In the military, seasoned generals who questioned his plans were replaced by younger, less experienced officers willing to execute his orders without hesitation. These changes weren't just political maneuvering, they reflected a deep psychological need in Hitler to be the sole architect of Germany's fate. Paranoia became one of the most defining traits of his leadership style. It was not paranoia in the purely clinical sense, it was a strategic paranoia, born from his understanding of how power works and his own fear of losing it. Hitler was convinced that enemies lurked everywhere, in foreign capitals, within the German high command, and even within his personal staff. This belief was fueled by real events, such as the attempted assassination plots against him. But it was also amplified by his tendency to see conspiracy where none existed. The July 20th, 1944 plot to kill him, led by members of the German military, only confirmed his worst suspicions and led to an even harsher crackdown. The mere hint of dissent became grounds for execution, and hundreds of officers, diplomats, and intellectuals were put to death in the purge that followed. Hitler's need for total control extended beyond military matters and into every corner of German life. Through the Nazi Party's elaborate network of informants, the Gestapo, and the SS, he built a surveillance state that monitored not only political opponents, but also ordinary citizens. Trust between neighbors eroded. People feared that a careless word, even in the privacy of their own homes, could lead to their arrest. This climate of fear was not a byproduct of Hitler's rule, it was the very foundation of it. He understood that controlling a population required more than propaganda. It required dismantling the very bonds of trust that allow communities to resist oppression. As the war intensified, Hitler's distrust of others reached pathological levels. He often issued orders directly to military units, bypassing his own generals. He micromanaged battlefield decisions from the comfort of his headquarters, believing his own instinct superior to the expertise of trained commanders. This hands-on interference often led to catastrophic outcomes, as seen in the failed offensives on the Eastern Front. Yet, in Hitler's mind, failure was never the result of flawed strategy. It was always due to the disloyalty, cowardice, or incompetence of others. His inability to accept responsibility was a psychological shield that preserved his self-image as a genius leader. Even as reality crumbled around him, his inner circle was a carefully constructed echo chamber. Figures like Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring understood the importance of feeding Hitler the version of reality he wanted to hear. Bad news was softened, disasters reframed as temporary setbacks, and any successes, no matter how small, were exaggerated to maintain the illusion of momentum. This created a dangerous feedback loop. Hitler, isolated from the truth, made decisions based on a distorted picture of the war, which in turn led to more disastrous outcomes. The bunker culture of his later years was the culmination of this psychological trajectory. By 1945, Hitler was living in a literal underground fortress, both physically and mentally cut off from the outside world. His paranoia had reached its zenith. He trusted almost no one, relying only on a shrinking group of aides whose loyalty was beyond question. In those final months, his conversations were filled with rants about betrayal by the military, by the German people, and even by fate itself. He spoke of traitors and cowards as if they were everywhere, invisible enemies gnawing away at his vision of a 1,000-year Reich. His obsessive need for loyalty was not just about securing power, it was about affirming his identity. Hitler saw himself as a man chosen by history, a savior whose destiny was beyond doubt. For someone with this self-image, betrayal was more than political opposition. It was a direct attack on the divine mission he believed himself to be fulfilling. This made his paranoia not only strategic, but deeply personal. To question him was to question the very destiny of Germany. In many ways, Hitler's paranoia and obsession with control were the very forces that doomed him. By silencing dissent, he deprived himself of the honest counsel that might have altered the course of the war. By surrounding himself with sycophants, he created an environment where no one dared tell him the truth, and by insisting on micromanaging military strategy, he made blunders that a more flexible leader might have avoided. His psychological need for control became a strategic liability, one that his enemies exploited to full effect. But for all its destructive consequences, Hitler's paranoia was also a survival mechanism, at least in the short term. It kept him in power far longer than many dictators might have lasted. It allowed him to maintain an iron grip on the Nazi state, even as the war turned against him. Yet in the end, it also left him isolated, mistrustful, and unable to adapt. The very traits that had once secured his dominance became the chains that bound him to his downfall. By the time the Red Army closed in on Berlin, Hitler's mental world was one of shadows and ghosts. He no longer spoke of victory in concrete terms, but clung instead to fantasies of miraculous weapons, sudden political shifts, or divine intervention. The reality outside his bunker was irrelevant. What mattered was the reality inside his head, a reality in which loyalty was absolute, betrayal was everywhere, and he, Adolf Hitler, remained the unquestioned leader of a Germany that existed more in his mind than in the bombed-out ruins above. In studying this period of his life, historians and psychologists alike have found a chilling lesson. Unchecked paranoia in a leader does not simply protect power, it corrodes it from within. For Hitler, the need for total loyalty became a psychological prison, one from which he could never escape. And as the walls of that prison closed in, so too did the fate of the Reich. He had built on fear, obedience, and the unquestionable authority of one man's will. Chapter 5. The Final Spiral: Delusion, Denial, and the Collapse of Reality. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, the Wehrmacht was retreating on every front, and Allied forces were closing in. But Hitler refused to accept defeat. In his mind, losses were temporary setbacks caused by betrayal or cowardice, never by flawed strategy. What others saw as the end, he saw as a test of his will. His paranoia, already deep, hardened into delusion. Advisors who presented the truth risked dismissal or rage. Strategic adaptability vanished. He clung to impossible offensives and miracle weapons as salvation. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was his most desperate gamble. Germany lacked the fuel, manpower, and air support for such an operation, but Hitler believed success would force the Allies into peace talks. When it failed, he blamed his generals, not the plan. As the Red Army advanced, he micromanaged the war from his headquarters, ordering defenses to hold every inch of ground regardless of cost. Retreat was weakness, and weakness was intolerable. Each failure was explained as treason or lack of faith. This denial insulated him from reality, even as Germany's physical and military collapse accelerated. By early 1945, Hitler had withdrawn to the Führer bunker beneath Berlin. Public appearances ceased. The bunker mirrored his mind, closed off, insulated, populated only by loyalists who reinforced his illusions. Outside, Berlin burned under Allied bombing. Inside, Hitler issued orders to divisions that no longer existed and spoke of victories that would never come. His thinking shifted toward fatalism. He declared that if the German people could not win, they deserved destruction. This culminated in the Nero Decree of March 1945, ordering the destruction of Germany's infrastructure to prevent its use by the enemy, an act that would have crippled civilian survival. Albert Speer secretly disobeyed, recognizing it as national suicide. By April, Soviet artillery surrounded Berlin. Hitler's health deteriorated. Tremors, pale skin, and frailty replaced the strongman image. Yet he refused evacuation, choosing to die in Berlin as a self-styled martyr. He compared himself to Frederick the Great, ignoring that Frederick's survival came from diplomacy, not sheer will. In the bunker's final days, Hitler-decorated teenage Hitler Youth soldiers spoke of phantom armies and awaited rescues that would never come. On April 28th, he learned Mussolini had been captured, executed, and publicly humiliated. Determined to avoid the same fate, he prepared for suicide. On April 29th, he dictated his political testament, still blaming Jews, Bolsheviks, and traitorous generals for Germany's collapse, showing no remorse or self-reflection. That night, he married Eva Braun. The next day, April 30th, Hitler shot himself while Braun took poison. Their bodies were burned outside the bunker to deny the Allies a public spectacle. Days later, Germany surrendered. Hitler had died clinging to the belief that he was betrayed, not defeated. His final months were defined by an unbroken refusal to accept reality, even when it destroyed his armies, his cities, and his nation. His collapse was not only personal, it consumed millions of lives. Battles were fought only to protect his pride. Civilian survival was sacrificed to his sense of destiny. In the end, Hitler's mind became the last fortress to fall. And by the time it did, nothing remained for him to rule. And that brings us to the end of this journey inside the mind of one of history's most infamous figures. If you made it this far, know that your support means the world to me. I create these stories with love and dedication, and every like, share, and subscription keeps this channel alive. But now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Hitler's mind was shaped more by his early personal struggles or by the political chaos of his time? And if history were to repeat itself, would we recognize such dangerous traits early enough to stop them?